In the last three lessons, we analyzed the mechanism of recognition, at least of a certain kind, of a certain species of recognition. We tried to establish, more particularly the last time, that one could first distinguish two more apparent and more visible ways of recognizing objects. There is first the automatic recognition, which consists in the adjunction to the very perception of the object of a series of ready-made movements in the organism, and whose ensemble represents a useful consecutive reaction of the perception experienced. This ready-made mechanism, by the very facility with which it comes into play, gives us the feeling of familiarity, so to speak, which going back towards the perception makes it recognized. It is a played, active, lived recognition rather than represented. We added that this wholly machinal recognition is common to animals and humans, that it is by it that humans generally begin, that it does not imply an effort of attention by which intelligence comes back to the perceived object, that it implies only on the part of the perceiving being a forward movement, an action which prolongs the perception. This is why we had distinguished alongside, moreover, this wholly machinal recognition which utilizes the recognized object, another recognition which implies attention, or rather is consecutive to the phenomenon of attention, consecutive to the state of attention, and consists not in simply prolonging the perception into useful reaction, but, coming back to it, in actively outlining its contours. This outline also built into the organism, this dynamic schema, as we called it, by the very facility with which it is executed, communicates to the perception, which serves to reconstruct it a kind of familiarity. I added that behind this schema, behind this outline, behind this nascent reaction, there are ordinarily such memories, memories of similar objects to the one we perceive, memories which can be not apparent, not absolutely conscious, but which we would find again in a way by deepening, by analyzing the dynamic schema we have just utilized. Such were the two species of recognition that we distinguished in our last lesson, and we said that one does not exclude the other, that the first prepares the second, that where the second is produced, there has generally been first a tendency towards the first, or even that the first has already taken place, but that the reciprocal is not true, the first being able to take place without the second occurring. We now come, I announced it last time, to a third species of recognition, which it is perhaps more difficult to define, but of which each of us has a very clear feeling. It has happened to all of us, gentlemen, to find ourselves after a certain number of years in a place where we formerly stayed. For example, it has happened to us, having reached a certain age, to find ourselves again in a house we had inhabited before. I suppose the objects have remained in place as they were. We know them. We know them first for what they are. They are usual objects, furniture, for example. We recognize them as table, armchair, etc. But do we stop there? And does something more intimate, more difficult to define, I recognize, not join the banal impersonal recognition, something truly our own, truly personal? You will tell me it is the association of ideas. The objects you perceive evoke in your mind the memories which were formerly attached to their perception. That is incontestable. There is that first, but the object itself, independently of the memories to which you attach it, does the object itself not appear, as recognized in the recognition we have of it, with a certain nuance, a coloring of its own which belongs precisely to what is part of a past and personal experience? I perceive a banal object, an armchair, which is like all armchairs, but the memory I have is not a banal memory. It is a memory which has a nuance, a coloring of its own. More than that, it is a personal memory. It is less a thing than a person, or rather, it is something of our person. It seems that something of our person has remained there. In short, whatever term one uses and whatever definition one gives, I believe the very clear feeling is that this object belongs to our personal experience, is placed, so to speak, in our personal history, belongs to this history and borrows from this history a certain coloring which holds in its nuance the recognition I have of my present perception. Now, if instead of taking an example of this kind, which is not usual, if I do not consider an armchair forming part of the furniture of a house I inhabited for years, but any armchair, any piece of furniture I know in my everyday familiar experience, well, I recognize it. That goes without saying, by a movement of utilization that I make and that I indicated last time. If I fix my attention by the schema I described in the last lesson, behind this schema I will find, I said, images, memories I have of previous perceptions I have had of this armchair, but these memories are banal, impersonal memories. However, if I examine any one of these memories separately, I notice that I can, by letting myself go, so to speak, go back to such and such a past scene to which this memory is linked, and going back to these scenes, restore to this image which has become banal something of this personal coloring that objects borrow from a personal past of which they are part. And then these images, which accompany the dynamic schema, are obtained precisely only by a mixture, like interference between them, of all these personal memories relating to this object, and which, by superimposing themselves, by interfering with each other, have ended up crystallizing reciprocally the nuance which each of them borrows from its place in our experience. So that these memories, perhaps one could, by leaning on each of these images, progressively find again all the personal and localized memories which served for their constitution. But, gentlemen, I do not insist on this point for the moment. I confine myself to summarizing what I have just said. Thus, one would have not two but three species of recognition, three main species in this continuity of different processes very close to each other, which constitute recognition in general. There would be thus three species of recognition, the first machinal, as I said just now, common to man and animal, by movements of utilization, the second human, but still practical, by the schematic, the active reconstitution, still semi-automatic, reconstitution which implies the intervention of memories of images, but of impersonal memories, memories which do not bear the mark of such and such an experience which is proper to us. And then finally, there is the recognition I will call personal, and it is by this that it is distinguished from the other two. It is a recognition which implies that the recognized object is recognized by me as forming part of my own and personal experience. Recognition which consequently implies that the memory accompanying the perception, situated behind it, is a memory localized in my past history, or, if it is not localized there, is localizable. A little research would be necessary, an effort rather negative, which consists on the contrary in relaxing, in abandoning oneself to reverie, a kind of negative effort to localize this memory more precisely in my history. But in any case, it distinguishes itself from any other in that it has, like a nuance, I will not say local, not a local color, but a temporal color. It is situated or can be situated in my past history. Here, then, are three species of recognition, the last, number 3, profoundly distinguishing itself from the other two, as the continuation of this analysis will show. But before pursuing this analysis, let us ask ourselves. It is a question one must always ask in such matters, especially when dealing with subtleties as delicate as these. Let us ask ourselves if this analysis corresponds only to, how shall I say, a point of view, if it is not a view of the mind, or if it is absolutely founded in nature. We said the other day, gentlemen, that there is in psychology a criterion, a means of distinguishing whether an analysis is natural or artificial, whether the elements distinguished by psychology are also distinguished by nature, or if they only exist distinct from the viewpoint of study. It is to turn to pathology, to the study of mental illnesses. If the illness presents in a dissociated state the various genres of recognition that we have just enumerated, the distinction will not be artificial. If, on the contrary, one never finds them separated from each other, one will be able to suspect the analysis of being only an artificial analysis, good from the viewpoint of the study of facts, good as a means of discussion, but not founded in the nature of things. If we consult pathology on this point, we find that, in effect, there are not many cases which have been observed, which come in support of this distinction. But the reason is that observers have never bothered to make this distinction and to seek it in the study of memory. One has almost always started with this idea that all memories are of the same kind, on the same plane, and differ from each other only by degree of complication. Hence it happens that often one has not taken the trouble to note the absence of this or that particular genre of recognition in illnesses which are characterized by the loss of recognition. However, there are cases where this dissociation has been clearly observed, even though the observer does not take the trouble to draw our attention to this point, and has not even grouped his observations in such a way as to make the distinction appear clearly to us. I will refer you in particular to a work which was published in a German review, Archiv für Psychiatrie und Nervenkrankheiten, in volume 23. In this work, there is found a work which is moreover well known and often cited by Mr. Gronau on a case of psychic blindness, that is to say, loss of visual recognition. This case is fairly curious from our point of view and very instructive. It is the case of a sculptor who recognized objects, but in a certain manner only. If we read this work, here is what we see. This subject had impersonal recognition, that is to say, recognition number 1 and number 2, but not personal recognition, that is recognition number 3. For example, he is shown a statue of Mercury, which he has just made himself, or which he made some time ago. He recognizes that it is a statue. He recognizes that it is Mercury, that it is the god Mercury. But he does not recognize that it is his statue of Mercury, the statue he made himself. He does not succeed in personalizing his memories. His memories remain in the impersonal state. I would not know how to say, the observer not having placed himself in this point of view. By what mode of recognition? No. 1 or no. 2 he recognizes, but recognition no. 3 is not there, or is there only so imperfectly that personal recognition does not occur. The observer also tells us that the subject recognizes a sofa as a sofa, but that he does not succeed in recognizing the sofa from his room. He does not succeed in imparting a personal nuance to the object which is part of his personal experience. In considering other well-known cases, one would find still other traces of this distinction. Let us note in passing, pathology shows us many cases of dissociation, but never in an absolutely clear state. One must not seek mathematical rigor and precision in such matters. Everything which is physiological or pathological, everything presents things to us, how shall I say, with vague, blurred outlines. Psychology, above all when expounding it, is necessarily obliged to insist more on outlines, to give more precision to expression, and to make clear things in a schematic form. Let us not seek too much precision or rigor in these pathological observations. Let us not try to make them too precise. It is enough that we have indications or traces in many cases where, apart from psychic disturbances, one recognizes cases of this dissociation. To take but one example, there is a classic case, one of the first to have been noted with us, which is related in all works relating to recognition. It is the classic observation concerning psychic blindness, the one generally cited when explaining in a course of psychology what this illness consists of. If we read carefully the account of this case, we see that it is not absolutely a case of psychic blindness, as those described since, a case of absolute psychic blindness, of absence of recognition of things. No, it is above all, although not exclusively so, absence of what I call recognition number 3, personal recognition. It concerns a very intelligent person who had preserved, besides the full use of his faculties, which were intact from every point of view, except that he did not recognize, we are told, objects perceived by sight. Yes, but if we read the details of this observation, we see that in general he recognized objects well enough as objects, only he did not relate them to his personal experience. We are told, for example, it concerns a man, that he did not recognize his wife and children. However, one does not say that he did not recognize them as a woman and as children. Now, in psychic blindness, when there is real loss of recognition, number 1 and number 2, recognition of objects as objects is not made. Therefore, what he was not capable of doing was simply this: situating the object in his personal experience, relating it to his personal experience. It was thus above all, not exclusively, I admit, recognition number 3 which was abolished. Consequently, this recognition is quite distinct from the other two, and there is a difference, an essential difference, probably between recognizing an object simply as object and recognizing it as forming part of one's history, one's experience, an experience which is personal to us. In the first case, we recognize the object for itself. In the other, we recognize it for ourselves. It forms part of us. It is completely different. It is quite another thing. I add, it is necessary to always come back to this point, that these 3 species of recognition that we have numbered 1, 2, and 3 follow each other, succeed one another in the very order in which we presented them. One must generally begin with mechanical recognition, continue, if one continues, with attentive recognition through dynamic schemas and impersonal images, and finish, if one finishes, with personal recognition accompanied by memories located in time. These 3 species of recognition are linked in such a way that the first does not presuppose the second, nor the second the third, whereas the reverse is not true, and the third presupposes the other 2, and the second the first. These would be the differences, and these would be the relationships between these 3 species of recognition. I would like to add that these are not absolute rules, and psychology, as I mentioned earlier, is obliged, especially in its exposition, to invoke general observations that apply to most cases, but not to all cases. In reality, there are many influences, disruptive causes that make psychology much less simple. However, I believe that the schema I have just presented is the one that is closest and most akin to reality. It is time now. This is what we have been aiming for in several lessons already. It is time to derive from the study of these various forms of recognition a conception of memory as a whole, because we did not want to study memory in the abstract, but concrete memory applied to the recognition of present objects. It is time to derive from this analysis of recognition a conception of the entire memory phenomenon. Moreover, it seems to me that this conception emerges naturally. First of all, based on what has been said before, there are memories that I would call purely mechanical, memories that consist of movements, bodily habits. Take a very simple example, the one we discussed earlier, the recognition of a chair. First, there is the recognition of the chair, which is, I would say, more played than thought or represented. It consists, when the chair is seen, in performing or at least preparing, sketching with the arms and legs, the movements of using the chair. It is all mechanical, all automatic recognition, like that which an animal can have of a familiar object. So, at the lowest level, we would place the memory that consists of actions, or rather motor reactions, already built into the organism and appropriate to their object. It would be good to draw a diagram on the board. If we want to represent this by a point, because it is something very narrow, let's call this point. Let's choose a letter to recognize it, and since we are talking about movement and mechanism, let's call it M. So, there is a point M where motor memory is located, memory in its narrowest and most frequent form. Now, above this memory that consists simply of organized motor reactions, above this point that represents memory in its narrowest form, we will place, if you will, the memory that we will call schematic memory, the dynamic schema accompanied by images that could serve to clarify it. I just used as an example a chair that one recognizes. Point M will be memory in its mechanical form, and then above it there will be all the memories and images of chairs in general, especially with the schema, the virtual outline of a chair drawing. We need to represent this by something much larger, infinitely larger, perhaps a circle, if you will, this dynamic schema accompanied by images from the past that are waiting to be located. Furthermore, this will be another level of memory. Therefore, if we assume M in the diagram, we must assume a perpendicular plane. For example, a circle in a plane perpendicular to the board. Here it is represented. Let's call it, still using letters to remind us of the thing, S and S. On the right side, there will be, if you will, the dynamic schema, the emerging outline of the chair, the possibility of drawing it, which helps us recognize it when we focus our attention on it. Then in S, there will be images of chairs, flying images, of which the schema is the summary. This schema is, in a way, the generative law of the chair's form, a law that summarizes individual chair images. Where there is a schema, one can always, as I mentioned earlier, with a little effort, retrieve the images, but it is not necessary for them to be there. They are virtually present. Now, above SS, we will put something else. We must assume that in addition to these image memories and the schema on the SS plane, there is, much higher up and behind, another plane that we will call RR. It is this RR plane on which all personal memories would then be arranged, localized in our past. That is, if it is a chair we are talking about, the memory of a certain chair that we know, which is connected to our history. Well, all these memories relate to different points in the past. All these memories would be there on this RR plane. They are there unconsciously, virtually. They could be represented, but generally, they do not represent themselves. In summary, we will say that memory includes in M all memories that consist of sketched or emerging movements, mechanical motor memories, rather motor tendencies, and it also includes in SS dynamic schemas and memories of impersonal images, and then much further up in RR personal images that are part of our history, located in our past experience. And then, if we want to represent the totality of memory, we must draw a cone from point M to circle RR, with RR as its base and M as its summit. The solid MSSRR, that is this inverted cone, will give us the schema we propose to represent memory. It would be a solid with a wide base, an almost infinite base, and an extremely narrow end, almost a mathematical point, a kind of cone, but it would be a solid. I emphasize this point. It is a kind of solid. This is important because this schema will distinguish, I believe, our conception of memory from most of the conceptions we will review. You will see that they all agree on the point that memory should not be considered as a solid, but as a surface. Let me explain. Theories generally agree on this point, that all memories are on the same plane and differ only in complexity. One memory is more complicated than another memory, and that's the only difference. If our schema is correct, it's not just a difference in complexity, there are also differences in quality, differences in spatial location, differences in planes. In memory, there are different levels. I will come back to this in the next lesson because it's an essential point that I cannot explain simply in passing. I just want to point out that current theories place all memories on the same plane because it's an essentially atomistic conception of the life of the mind. It starts from the idea that psychological states are like atoms. Psychological states seem to be atoms that aggregate, that disintegrate among themselves, and in the end, psychological states differ from each other only by their greater or lesser composition or complexity. And there is no absolute difference in nature between memories, only differences in degree of complexity. If we delve into this theory, we find that it is inspired first by an a priori view, by a theory, I would say, which is mainly derived from the analysis of language, especially from the analysis of what has been called the association of ideas. It is an empirical theory to some extent, but also very philosophical, which explains associationism. However, if we delve into the associationist analysis of the mind, we find that it is precisely the associationist theory that explains all the facts in a wrong way. It is especially the associationist theory that gives us a completely false analysis of memory. That's what I want to show in the next lesson. This theory is the one that dominated psychology for many centuries, not so long ago, and it is still dominant, despite some great efforts that have been made in recent years to go beyond it. It is this theory that we must examine and which will allow us to appreciate better the originality of our schema, to appreciate the great distances that separate us from the ancient psychological doctrines that are still dominant.